Jimmy Fallon in tears when Morgan Freeman suddenly walks off stage after seeing this letter. Morgan Freeman stood up from his chair, mid-sentence, and walked off the Tonight Show stage. Not during a commercial break, not after a cue. Mid-answer, while Jimmy Fallon was still leaning forward with a follow-up question on his lips. 300 people in the studio watched him go. Nobody said a word. It was a Thursday night in November, and The Tonight Show had been on a run. The bookings were strong, the ratings were climbing, and Morgan Freeman, at 86, still carrying that voice like something carved from a different century, had agreed to a rare, in-depth interview. Not a press tour, not a film promotion, just a conversation. The audience that night skewed older, 55 to 70. The kind of crowd that had grown up with Freeman's face on screens before they knew his name. They had come from Newark, from White Plains, from a town in Pennsylvania whose name Jimmy never caught. They had come because they understood, in the way audiences sometimes do, that this was a man worth sitting still for. Everything was right. Everything was in place. The control room still talks about what happened that night. A producer named Elaine Marsh, who had worked in television for 24 years, would say afterward that she had never once in her career asked a camera operator to hold a shot without instruction. She asked that night. A letter arrived on the desk. Not handed over dramatically. Not announced. Jimmy had slid it across between two questions, almost like an afterthought, because that was how the segment had been designed. A small thing. An old envelope. Edges soft from decades of folding and unfolding. Not a prop. Not a reproduction. Just a letter. Old, the handwriting in blue ink, slightly faded. Morgan Freeman's hand stopped moving. His head tilted. His right hand reached out and touched the corner of the envelope before his fingers closed around it. He didn't open it immediately. He just held it. His jaw shifted. His eyes went very still, and then his chest rose once, slowly, the way a person breathes when they are trying to hold something inside. Morgan, Jimmy's voice was barely audible. 2 words, then one. "You okay?" The entire studio froze. The band went quiet without being asked. People assumed, in those first seconds, that something medical was happening. He was 86. He had been sitting in that chair for 40 minutes. 300 people held their breath. His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, but caught perfectly by his microphone. Dolores. Just that. One name. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1962. Morgan Freeman wasn't always Morgan Freeman, the voice of God, the man who narrated the universe into something bearable. In the autumn of 1962, Morgan Freeman was 25 years old and recently discharged from the United States Air Force, where he had served since 1955. He had enlisted at 18 wanting to fly jets, had trained as a radar mechanic instead, and had spent 7 years deciding that the only thing he had ever truly wanted to do was act. He had arrived in Los Angeles with almost no money and considerably less certainty than he projected, and he had enrolled in acting classes at a small theater workshop on the east side of the city that no longer exists. The building is a parking structure now. 60 people could fit inside it if they stood close. That fall, the workshop had announced it was struggling financially and might close by Christmas. Most of the students were younger than Freeman, a handful of them serious, most of them passing through on their way to something else. There was a woman who taught there on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Her name was Dolores Vance. She was 51 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Atlanta who had moved to California after her husband died and had found the workshop through a notice in a community paper. She had no professional credits. She had no connections to the industry. What she had was a quality that Freeman would describe, 60 years later, in a sentence he had never given to a journalist. She listened as if your words were the only words being spoken anywhere on earth. She came alone to every session, because none of her friends quite understood why she gave her evenings to a room full of young people practicing scenes. She paid the small weekly fee out of her fixed income, and she sat in the third row, and she watched with her hands folded. Freeman was working on a scene from Death of a Salesman that November, and he kept losing the emotional thread in the second half. He had the lines, he had the blocking, he had everything except the thing that made it real. After the third session where it fell apart, Dolores stayed behind while the others left, and she said to him, simply, that he was trying to demonstrate grief instead of carry it. That carrying it meant letting the audience see the weight without ever showing them the load. He stood there in his coat, keys in his hand, and asked her what she meant. She talked for 40 minutes. About her husband. About what it felt like to watch a man you had loved for 30 years disappear slowly. About the specific way grief lives in the body before it reaches the face. He did not take notes. He did not need to. The scene worked the following Tuesday. Dolores was in the third row. She did not applaud at the end, but she smiled once, a small, private thing. And that was enough. They spoke after class for the rest of that winter. Not frequently, not dramatically, just two people who found that conversation was easy between them. She told him she had been a music teacher in Atlanta, that she had a daughter in Sacramento whom she saw twice a year, that she had always believed the best thing a teacher could do was disappear into her students' work. In December, before the workshop's last session before the holidays, she pressed a folded sheet of paper into his hand in the doorway. She had written him a letter, not long, 1 page, both sides. She told him, in the careful handwriting of someone who had once graded papers, that she believed he was going to do something that mattered, and that she wanted him to have those words in writing so he could return to them on the days when he did not believe it himself. He put it in his coat pocket. He kept the coat for 6 years. When the coat wore out, he moved the letter. The workshop closed in January. He did not see Dolores Vance again. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Fame is the force that carries people away from the things they love without ever asking permission. Freeman's career moved slowly, and then all at once, the way careers do when the work is real. Street Smart, Driving Miss Daisy, The Shawshank Redemption, C7, $1 Million Baby. Each role landing in a life that had become, by any measure, enormous. He thought of Dolores sometimes. He had tried once, in the early 90s, to find her through a letter to the workshop's last known address, which bounced back. He had thought of her the way you think of the people who shaped you before you knew you were being shaped. The letter had moved from coat pocket to desk drawer to a wooden box he kept in his study in Charleston, Mississippi, 60 years in the same fold lines. He had read it perhaps 200 times. 3 weeks before the Tonight Show taping, a woman named Carol Vance had contacted the show through the Talent Relations Office. She was Dolores's daughter. Dolores had died in August. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March, gone in 5 months the way it goes. She was 93 years old. In the weeks before she died, she had asked Carol to do one thing. She had said, with the calm of someone who had settled all her accounts, find Morgan Freeman and tell him that she kept every letter he ever wrote her, and that she had been right about him. Carol had found 7 letters. Handwritten, Morgan Freeman had not remembered writing them. And then, when she sent photographs of the envelopes, he remembered everything. He had written to the workshop's address every year from 1963 to 1969. He had assumed they never arrived. Dolores had received every one. Carol had brought the original letter, the one Dolores had pressed into his hand in the doorway in December 1962, to The Tonight Show that night, framed under archival glass, and it sat in the audience in her bag while Morgan Freeman sat in the chair across from Jimmy Fallon, not knowing what was in the envelope on the desk. Behind the scenes, Freeman had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He had been told only that there was a guest in the audience with a personal connection to his past. He had agreed, at Carol's request, not to be briefed further. He wanted the moment to be real. He had sat in the makeup chair and told the segment producer, quietly, "I want her to feel like a person, not a moment." But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. The whispered name had barely left his mouth when Carol Vance stood up from the fourth row. She was 68 years old, her mother's daughter in the set of her shoulders. She was holding a frame against her chest with both hands. Freeman saw her from the stage and went completely still. Jimmy Fallon looked from Freeman to Carol and back again. He climbed off his chair, quietly, without thinking, and stood to the side. 300 people had the context now. 300 people understood what was in the room. Morgan Freeman came down off the stage without being invited. He walked up the aisle toward Carol Vance, and when he reached her, he stopped, and she held out the framed letter, and he took it in both hands. He stood there in the aisle of the Tonight Show set, in front of 300 people and however many cameras, holding his own words from 1962. He unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something that has been folded for 60 years. She kept it. Carol's voice was steady, all of it. He looked up from the letter. "She never got my letters. I thought she got every one." Her hands were trembling slightly. She had a box. Freeman's jaw moved. He looked down at the letter again. He read one line, silently, and then his eyes closed. "She told me something," Carol said. Before she went, she said, "Tell him I was right." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Maybe 4. I was just a music teacher. Her voice broke on the last word. No, his voice, barely above a whisper, carrying all the way to the back of the room. "You were the first person who ever understood." Jimmy Fallon was crying. He had not moved from the side of the stage. He did not attempt to take the moment back. He said, to the room, in a voice that was not a host voice and not a performance, "Folks, I think we need to let this happen." Questlove stood up from the drum kit. The director did not cut to commercial. The cameraman closest to the aisle did not cut away. The standing ovation began somewhere in the middle of the audience and moved outward through the room the way water moves when something is dropped into it. Freeman and Carol Vance stood in the aisle for a long time. He still had the frame in his hands. He was not performing anything. He was just present, in the fullest way a person can be, with someone who had come a long way to deliver the last message of a woman who had believed in him before he had learned to believe in himself. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The letter was framed in the hospital room where Dolores Vance died that August, hanging on the wall to her left so she could see it without turning her head. After the Tonight Show taping, Morgan Freeman flew to Sacramento and sat with Carol for an afternoon. He read his own letters from 1963 to 1969 and did not speak for long stretches. He asked for a copy of each one. At Dolores Vance's memorial service, which had taken place in a small church in Sacramento on a Saturday in early September, a man sat in the third row who had not been invited and had not announced himself. He did not speak. He did not perform. He sat with his hands folded in his lap the way she had once sat in the third row of a workshop that no longer exists. and he stayed until the last person left. 11 weeks after the taping, Carol sent Jimmy Fallon a photograph taken by a guest at the memorial. He framed it and put it on his desk. It is still there. Some letters wait 60 years to complete their delivery.